Important.
Yeah, no.
Okay, good evening, everyone. Welcome to another wand waving event put on by the Women and Development Unit of the University of the West Indies Open Campus and the Barbados Family Planning Association. This evening, we are going to be talking about child abuse and the Caribbean boy child. And we have before we start, one of the things I'd like us to know is you can follow the conversation on UA Open Campus's Facebook page or on our YouTube channel if you're not on the Zoom call. Here on the Zoom call, we ask that you wait until the Q&A section to ask any questions, but you can put your questions and concerns and queries in the chat during the entire discussion, and we will respond to those as best as possible during the course of the discussion. What I'm going to do this evening is to set the context and then go straight into introducing the panelists that we have this evening. And talking about child abuse in the Caribbean is nothing strange, because as we know, the problem of violence in the Caribbean is something that has been discussed. It is also something that has been condemned.
No blood is that.
Before I continue, can I ask that those who are on the Zoom call to ensure that they're muted, right? And to keep the cameras closed. Thank you so much. As you know, we're streaming live on Facebook and YouTube, okay? Appreciate it. So as I was saying, we know that the rates of violence in the Caribbean is extremely high, and it's equally alarming because it appears to be on the increase even in countries who have had traditionally lower levels of violence, such as the countries in the Eastern Caribbean. All of the Caribbean countries, we share a similar cultural and historical background which started with violence in terms of our modern history, from the decimation of most of the indigenous peoples after the arrival of Europeans in the late 15th century, straight into the enslavement of Africans to work on plantations, and later the arrival of East Indian and other ethnic groups as indentured laborers. In all instances, violence has been at the core of it. And one of the things it has been noticed and observed in terms of studies that there are links between the colonial experience and that has continued in terms of how violence is practiced in the Caribbean. So what is abnormal and an unacceptable way to treat human beings have unfortunately become a normal way of treating each other, including the humanity of children, which is our focus this evening. So violence as punishment runs through our homes, our schools, our court systems, and other institutions. And it is arguably quite endemic, even though it is something that is preventable. It's a power imbalance between the abuse of power by adults over children and a general lack of the recognition of the humanity of children by adults, undergirded with a belief of seeing children as a proprietorial extension of their parents rather than citizens in their own right. When we look at some of the data across the region, the extent of child abuse is quite endemic, where large numbers of children are believed to be affected. The figures differ in their magnitude, but in all cases, they're quite high. Surveys, and some of the surveys that I'm going to speak to either come from UNFPA, UNICEF, national surveys that have been come under specific projects such as the None in 1, None in 3 project, and or the UNICEF's multiple indicator cluster survey, as well as a few cases, academic studies that I'm also going to cite from. But surveys of adults and children's experiences of child abuse and neglect reveal a higher prevalence of violence against children than the official figures suggest. This implies that there is a significant amount of underreporting, and some of the reasons are things like a fear of reprisal, shame among family members, a view that because it's a private matter, the family's economic dependence on the perpetrator, a child's fear of the perpetrator, or a lack of awareness of what constitutes abuse because of what was abnormal has become normal. So one of the other challenges that we see is because of all of that, you find that professionals such as police, teachers, and healthcare professionals are often not aware rather, of the consequences of abuse and neglect and the social sanctioning of child abuse or lack thereof. When we look at Jamaica and Ghana, for instance, we see that child abuse and neglect occurs across all socioeconomic groups and family structures. However, children from homes of lower economic status, from inner city communities and in rural poor areas who have a parent with mental health problems or drug and alcohol problems are the most vulnerable. Children of certain groups are reported to be at heightened risk for child abuse and neglect. For instance, children from minority groups such as Carib children in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, in Dominica and also in Guyana, and the Maroon children in Suriname have been reported to experience high levels of physical abuse and sexual abuse than from the broader population. Children with disabilities are reported to be at a heightened risk for all types of abuse, such as physical, sexual, and emotional abuse and neglect. Often children and children with absentee parents are also seen as being more at risk for physical abuse. There are some reports that say children between the ages of 4 and 12 are the ones who are most at risk for child abuse and neglect. The type of child abuse with the highest reports of incidents differ by country. For instance, in Jamaica and Dominica, sexual abuse has the highest incidence. In Grenada, it's abandonment and neglect. In Belize and Barbados, neglect and physical abuse have the highest reports of incidents, according to country reports. So when we're looking in terms of the population that's affected, children, we're looking at about a third of the entire Caribbean population. And if we want to just have a clear idea of what abuse is, child abuse is rather, child abuse includes all forms of violence against people under 18 years old. For infants and younger children, the abuse mainly involves child maltreatment, which is physical, sexual, and emotional abuse and neglect at the hands of parents or other authority figures or persons in positions of authority. Boys and girls are at equal risk of physical and emotional abuse and neglect. Girls are at greater risk for sexual abuse. As children reach the adolescence, peer violence and intimate partner violence, in addition to maltreatment, become more prevalent. But it can be prevented. And it's preventing it, as I said, we had said before, is because in almost the majority of cases, children are abused by adults. And from it means that they're abused by adults, it means that adults have the responsibility to attend to their wounds, so to speak, attend to their trauma so that it does not impact their children and, continue the cycle of violence. In the Caribbean, we have 3 types of abuse, which are all intergenerational: sexual violence against both girls and boys, corporal punishment against both girls and boys, and peer-on-peer bullying, physical, verbal, and cyberbullying. We look at violence as discipline. 70% of the children in Trinidad and Tobago, Barbados, and St. Lucia have experienced some form of violence as a means of discipline. 5 out of 10 children have experienced physical punishment, and 6 or more out of 10 children have experienced psychological aggression. One third of adults in Barbados believe that children need to be physically punished for disciplining. And in Barbados, children under 12 are particularly susceptible to physical violence at home and at school. Corporal punishment is still a common form of discipline in Barbados, within schools, public and private, and it has not yet been banned by law. When we look at sexual abuse in the Eastern Caribbean, we found that 10% of the sexual abuse victims across the Eastern Caribbean are boys between the ages of 12 and 16. Virtually all the perpetrators are either, half of them is male or female, and they're known to the victim or it's a person in position of authority, a family member, or a family friend. The victims of child neglect and physical abuse are evenly split between girls and boys. Around 80% of the perpetrators are their mothers. Nearly all of the women, the parents rather, their mothers are single parents, and over 50% are unemployed. All of the inmates in Barbados reported to receiving corporal punishment as children, and slightly more than half of them witnessed violence against their mother when they were children. The latest data that we have for Barbados in terms of cases of child abuse is 2017, and 547 of them, this included neglect in the 5 to 11 age group. Unfortunately, I don't have data disaggregated by gender or by types of abuse. That's just an aggregate figure for all children reported as being abused. In terms of Jamaica, when we're looking at the most recent official data that's available, physical abuse is almost half and half between girls and boys. In 2017, 11,907 boys and 11,406 girls. It's overwhelmingly in the opposite direction with sexual abuse for girls to 24,745 for girls and 2,371 for boys. In terms of emotional abuse, 5,350 boys, and for neglect, 18,671 boys, and we could go on. In terms of children who are in need of care and protection, almost half and half. In 2017, over 16,000 boys were reported to be in need of care and protection. So, I mean, I could go on. There are quite a few more statistics, but one of the things, 3 quick things I wanted to kind of conclude on, that nearly 30% of the children, and this is from a study that looked at victimization, violence, perpetration, and attitudes towards violence among boys and girls in Barbados and Grenada. And this study was conducted in 2017, involving 1,378 children and adolescents from both Barbados and Grenada. And 30% of the children in Barbados and about 40% of the children in Grenada were exposed to physical violence in the family. Barbadian boys are more likely to experience physical abuse in the family in comparison to Barbadian girls. Among 35% of the youths in Barbados and about 41% in Grenada indicated having experienced emotional abuse. In excess of 9% of the youth from Barbados and about 13% from Grenada admitted having experienced sexual abuse in the family. In Barbados, boys are more like, oh, I said that already. So basically, boys from both Barbados and Grenada, compared with girls from the same 2 countries, were more accepting of male physical domestic violence and social norms regarding the use of physical violence against girls and against other boys, as well as the use of violence in general. Boys from both countries were more likely to engage in violent and bullying behaviors, and over 50% of the children from Barbados and nearly 53% of the children from Grenada indicated agreement with the statement that most girls hit their boyfriends. And boys, compared with girls, are more likely to agree with their statement. And then now, when we're looking at overall cases in terms of looking at regional rates, emotional violence is about 10%, physical abuse is 25%, and sexual abuse is 35%, and neglect stands at 30%. So what you can see is we really and truly have a serious problem. Child abuse across the entire region is widespread. And it's something that we really do need to look at. So one of the reasons, this is pretty much the core reason why we're having this discussion today. So now that I've not overburdened, but I've given you quite a lot of data to suck up on, but I wanted to use the data to give us a context for the discussion so that you could get a clear understanding of the situation that we're looking at and the main reason of the event, which is to focus on the Caribbean boy child. This evening, we are joined by 3 experts, Dr. Catherine Herbert, Mr. Owen Blacker Ellis, and Fabian Sargent, and also by my colleague, Mr. Anderson Langdon from the Barbados Family Planning Association. Our first speaker this evening is Catherine Herbert, and she's a registered clinical psychologist working both in Barbados and Canada. And she completed her doctoral training at the School of Clinical I'm so sorry, clinical child psychology, and through the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education at the University of Toronto. She has over 10 years of experience providing psychological assessments and treatment services in community mental health and in school settings. She's a dual citizen of both Barbados and Canada. And so she's also a consultant to the Queen Elizabeth Hospital and the Barbados Fertility Center. Her experience, of course, focuses quite a bit on children and youth, and we're going to allow her to present to you this evening on the Caribbean child abuse and the Caribbean boy child. And so before I go any further, I'm going to hand over to Dr. Catherine Herbert. Catherine, over to you.
Thanks so much for doing such a comprehensive review and highlighting the seriousness and severity of the problem. I really appreciate your introduction. So I'm going to attempt to share my screen. Let me know if there are any difficulties, please. Okay, are we good to go, Taitu?
Yes, you're good to go.
Okay, so I'll be presenting tonight on breaking the intergenerational cycle of violence, which Ms. Heron spoke so comprehensively about just now in reviewing the data, a legacy of our history of colonialism and that trauma that's being repeated through families in the Caribbean. I'm a clinical psychologist specializing in pediatrics. I work with children and their families in Barbados. Thanks very much to UE, WAND, and BSPA for inviting me to be here tonight. I'd like to start by introducing you to two case studies, which I'm going to come back to throughout the presentation and at the very end, to hopefully make what can be theoretical seem very real. I'd like to highlight that these case studies are fictional. They're based on no one single individual patient in order to protect confidentiality. So the first young man, Dante, that I'm going to introduce you to appeared in my clinic at the age of 16, referred due to violent and aggressive behavior. I remember the first day that he came in and sat and started to talk and told me how his whole life people had told him that he was bad, he was a bad boy. And he said eventually he just embraced it, and that's what he started to be. And I remember him looking up at me, his head in his hands, and saying, "Doc, I just want a better life." This young man had been abused by both his father and his mother in the home throughout his childhood, severe physical abuse, cases of abandonment, times that he had spent the night on the street, as well as abuse from men in the community. We're going to come back to Dante, but I'd like you to bear him in mind as we go through the following slides. The next young man I want to talk to is a young father. We're going to call him Jason. Jason also experienced abuse from his father as he was growing up, and he found in raising his 8-year-old son that the trauma triggers were coming back. In one of his first sessions, he told me, "I hear my father's voice in my head. I want to stop what I'm doing to my son, but I can't." So again, think about Jason, and we're going to come back to him, and I'll tell you how his case unfolded at the very end. I have two colleagues from QEH here tonight, Dr. Catherine Trotman and Ms. Amanda Kelman, also clinical psychologists, and we work together as a team at the Queen Elizabeth Hospital in Barbados. In an interview with Dr. Trotman earlier today, she runs the SCAN clinic at the hospital, which is suspected child abuse and neglect. She highlighted several trends to me, specifically as it relates to boys. So what Dr. Trotman highlighted is that the most common referral reason for boys to come into the hospital, to the child abuse clinic, is physical abuse. And one of the things that she's noted is that the threshold for what's considered to be physical abuse is higher for boys than it is for girls. So where A physical act or harm against a girl may be considered abuse. With a boy, that may be considered discipline. And it really requires something severe, such as a broken limb, a beating with a weapon, or a burn, in order for a boy to be referred to the hospital for physical abuse. Furthermore, when a boy is sexually assaulted by a man, it is taken both more seriously by family members as well as professionals such as doctors, nurses, child protection officers, police officers. And when that same sexual assault happens to a girl, the horror and the emotional reaction of those involved appears to be heightened when a boy is sexually assaulted by a man than when a girl is sexually assaulted by a man. Sexual abuse of boys by girls or women, so when the girls or the women are the perpetrators of the abuse, is rarely reported or addressed. And in fact, the boy may be commended and viewed with pride for his sexual activity. If two minor children engage in sexual acts, as is very common, whether that sexual act is consensual or coerced, the girl is almost automatically referred for medical and psychological treatment. She's seen for swabs, she's seen for bloods and medical examination, she's enrolled in counseling, and the boy is not referred at all. Dr. Trotman or Ms. Kalman, please jump in if you have anything to add. I welcome your comments and your input. I sat back and I thought about my conversation with Dr. Trotman, and together we reflected that there are cultural beliefs underpinning these trends which we're seeing in our community and in our general hospital. Part of it is what Ms. Heron referred to in the introduction, which is that boys may encounter violence as a normalized part of their existence within homes, schools, and the wider community. Violence may be seen as a legitimate way to resolve conflict and to teach boys, to instill discipline, to instill values, to instill morality. Relationships with boys are regularly characterized by the use of fear and corporal punishment. Prejudice against sexual orientation and sexual diversity in the Caribbean is ingrained in the way boys are raised. I've lost count of the number of little boys who are slapped or lashed in my office for picking up a toy that is pink or for picking up a baby doll to play with. Boys who are abused by men may fear being perceived as homosexual, and that shame and stigma may lead to underreporting and silence regarding the sexual abuse of boys. So some of the trends that we're talking about in the data, with sexual abuse being higher for girls than boys, may in fact be misleading. Patriarchal beliefs, again a legacy of our history and colonialism, may continue to be perpetrated by current cultural beliefs and attitudes, wherein boys must not be seen as victims. They do not need protection from women, and they must in fact dominate women. Boys' identity is also closely linked to their sexuality, and the view of the Caribbean male as a hypersexual being whose pride and identity is linked to their sexual prowess appears to persist. Furthermore, sex may be seen as transactional, a give and take. A mother who sleeps with someone to get money for their child's school books, an interaction of power and authority. Often boys in the Caribbean are told to man up. They're told to be tough, to be strong, to not show their emotions, and to interact with others in an aggressive way so that no one takes advantage of them. A recent report through the IDB by Lawrence Telson highlighted that the bottom line is that manning up boys does not add value. Its negative impact is reflected in recent data on Caribbean women and men with respect to employment trends, educational achievement, and professional development. So what this report from the IDB was highlighting is that while Caribbean women are breaking gender barriers and entering tertiary education and the workforce in increasing numbers, our boys are being left behind. And it's our boys who are bearing the brunt of corporal punishment in schools where their academic achievement is impacted by that violence. It's boys who are continuing to engage in violence in all kinds of their relationships, and this is holding them back in terms of their future. I'm going to walk you through some of the physical, psychological, neurological, and behavioral consequences of childhood abuse. Physically, they are childhood abuse, abandonment, neglect, maltreatment is linked to a myriad of diseases for children. There's not only the immediate injury, the broken arm, the burn, the cuts, the scars, but there are long-term health consequences resulting from the maltreatment and the deprivation and the violence that children in chronically abusive situations experience. This ranges from things we see commonly in the hospital, like diabetes and heart issues, to cancer, stroke, bowel disease, chronic fatigue, high blood pressure, migraines. The stress manifests in the body and is closely related to physical illness. The neurological consequences of child abuse and neglect can be severe. So there's several regions of the brain that may not form or function in the way that we would expect them to in a normally developing child when we look at the brain development of children in deprived and abusive and stressful situations. So I want to highlight some of these areas for you and then talk about what this means for our boys who are growing up with child abuse. The amygdala can be affected, and the amygdala is used for processing our emotions and managing our fight, flight, freeze response. When I think about both Dante and Jason, when they were triggered and they went into survival response, the fight reaction came out and they were ready. They were ready to burn, to pull a knife. They were ready to run. And this is at the neurological level that children who've grown up having to be hypervigilant for their safety, this wire trips, this alarm goes off, and they're ready to survive. They're ready to protect themselves because of this early childhood trauma. The hippocampus can also be affected, and the hippocampus is implicated in learning and memory. So again, let's think about boys under achievement at school and how that could possibly be related to the corporal punishment that they're experiencing at school and at home. The orbitofrontal cortex, which is involved in good decision making. We want our boys to make smart decisions. When they're abused, when they're stressed, they can't do that. This region of the brain is also involved in self-control and self-regulation, our ability to match our behavior to the situation, to calm ourselves down when we're upset. The cerebellum, which is involved in both motor movement and executive functioning. Executive functioning is like the management tools of our brain. How do we organize our time? How do we edit our work? How do we plan ahead? How do I connect what I'm doing today to future consequences? So it's our ability to think about the way that we think and to think about the way that we act. And we see severe executive functioning delays in children growing up in difficult circumstances. The corpus callosum can also be affected, and this is the part of the brain that allows our right and left hemispheres to communicate with each other. So it's an integral communication pathway, and this can also be affected. So let's think about a boy who's having difficulty making decisions, who's having difficulty controlling and processing his emotions, who's having difficulty remembering information and learning because he's growing up in an abusive household. Think about the ripple effect that that can have on him. Furthermore, we're taking this neurological research into the field of epigenetics. So epigenetics refers to how our DNA changes over the course of our life. We're learning more and more that our genetic code isn't written in pen, it's written in pencil, and it can be changed based on our life experiences. So we're seeing genetic differences in children who have experienced trauma and abuse that actually get passed on at the level of DNA to subsequent generations. This might include a predisposition to medical illnesses like cancer, as well as predispositions to psychiatric issues as well. So the DNA code of a child can actually be altered and passed on to future generations at the genetic level as a result of the experience of childhood abuse. Psychologically, we can see post-traumatic stress, depression and suicide, lower levels of self-confidence, difficulties forming trusting and loving attachments and relationships to both peers and adults, stress-related disorders, and underachievement at school and at work. Behaviorally, children who have been abused are more likely to be involved in the forensic system or the juvenile justice system, to engage in unhealthy sexual practices and sexual relationships throughout their lifespan. There's a higher instance of substance abuse and a perpetuation of violence and unhealthy power dynamics in intimate relationships. There's also a cost to society of child abuse due to increased doctor's visits, increased hospitalization, increased incarceration, and increased need for social and community support. If we think about some of the risk factors that Ms. Heron highlighted at the beginning, whether that includes parental mental illness, parental substance abuse, poverty, parent stress levels, we need to also think about protective factors and what helps children survive this. We've talked a lot about the pain and the complications that can arise, and I think we need to switch gears now and talk about possibilities for intervention and for hope. Because the truth is that neurological scans show that children's brains are malleable, and that with appropriate support and intervention, their brains can rewire, their brains can in fact heal. This isn't a stamp on them for the rest of their life if they receive change and support and help. And that's what persons in the community, I think, are trying to do, to turn the spotlight on that and to support children and their families. So things that can help are changing the nurturing and attachment that that child experiences with caregivers, providing parents with realistic expectations for child development and alternative parenting strategies, alternatives to corporal punishment that still instill the same Caribbean values and morality in children, offering concrete support, whether that's safe housing, whether that's financial support, whether that's food, tangible support to make sure that children and parents' basic needs are met. Social support can be huge. Maybe that's a neighbor, maybe that's a great aunt, but involving people who care about those children can make a huge amount of difference. And teaching children social and emotional competencies through counseling, therapy, peer relationships, and school. I'd like to quickly highlight a program that I'm familiar with through a professor at University of Toronto called Caring Dads, Safer Children. And it's now been run in several different countries, including the UK, with a really good evidence base behind it. The stats here we're familiar with, the outcomes we're familiar with, but we need to talk too about the positive impact that dads can have when they're involved in an active and constructive way in their kids' lives. When we have dads who have positive relationships with their children, they can make all the difference. Those children do better developmentally, cognitively, emotionally, and socially. And yet when a child is at risk or a father is the perpetrator of abuse, he is often excluded from involvement in intervention services. And I do see that with our child protection system and our hospital system in Barbados, that often it's the mother and the children who receive treatment and the father does not, even though he is the one that requires monitoring, intervention, and support in order to make a meaningful difference to his behavior and his relationship with his children. So I think this is one area where we can really do better. In a program targeted at dads, such as this Caring Dads program, the goal is to try to end the violence between the mother and the father. Many children are witness to domestic violence, as Ms. Heron highlighted, and to develop healthy ways to co-parent between mother and father. The dad needs to be coached in child-centered parenting, how to provide greater empathy and emotional support and strengthen a healthy attachment with his child or children. The dad needs to take responsibility and accountability for his abusive actions in order to rebuild trust and create a future that he can be a part of. This must include involvement from professionals and the community to monitor, support, and ensure children's safety. And it's not always the case that the perpetrator of the abuse can be safely involved, only in a percentage of cases. So let's come back to Dante. This was my 16-year-old who was referred because of violent and aggressive behavior, homicidal ideation, and he had experienced corporal punishment at both home and school. He'd been asked to leave school because of getting in fights at school. He'd been put out of his home several times. He'd bounced back and forth between mom's house and dad's house, and neither was a safe place for him to be. So through counseling, Dante came to understand that his instinct for aggression was triggered by this childhood of trauma, that he'd not been treated in a way that was okay or acceptable, and that this was PTSD, that there was nothing wrong with him, but that he'd had a really difficult start to life. So learning some of those executive function skills, the emotional regulation skills, self-control, decision-making, communication. You know, he showed up every week and he was there. An educational assessment revealed that his IQ was off the charts. This was an incredibly smart young man, but he had undiagnosed dyslexia, and his whole life he'd been told that he was stupid because he hadn't been able to learn how to read. So with appropriate mentorship and placement, he was able to get into vocational training and start a career. Through counseling, he talked and thought a lot about how to develop healthy relationships with women. This started with his sister, and then in terms of dating. And, you know, when I saw him with his nieces and nephews, it was a whole other side to this tough young man. He just melted. And from saying, you know, Doc, I just want a better life. On one of our last meetings, he said, Doc, one day I'm going to be a really good dad. I also want to come back to Jason, whose 8-year-old son was referred because he wasn't doing well at school, and the pediatrician suspected he might have ADHD. And then through the sessions, the 8-year-old disclosed that there were times his father had burned him, had attacked him with a knife, had threatened to kill him. And through involving the dad in therapy, he disclosed that his father had done similar and worse things to him throughout his life, that he was trying really hard to be different, but he didn't know how. But this dad was incredible, and he was willing to do the work. We worked a lot on forgiving himself and showing compassion to himself, recognizing the role that trauma had played in his life. He took responsibility for his actions, and he apologized to his 8-year-old son. And that ownership and that apology began the process of repair and trust in that relationship. This dad was able to make a meaningful change in his parenting practices, to control his anger, to not overreact to minor misbehaviors, and to use positive parenting methods to guide his son and to coach his son. He said to me, I want the best for my son. I'm willing to work with my son's mother. I'm willing to make the change. So it's through boys like Dante and dads like Jason that we have real hope. Brains can be rewired, relationships can be repaired, futures can be changed, and the intergenerational cycle of violence can be broken. Thank you very much, and I welcome any questions, concerns, or comments, whether that's now or later. I leave that up to Ms. Herron.
Thank you so much, Catherine. That was definitely a mouthful and so many things to think about. Definitely appreciate it.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
So if anyone has any questions now, can you just place them in the chat and we'll address them later on. Oh, okay, we have one here from here. The question is, how long did it take Jason to come to you?
Well, Jason didn't come voluntarily. He came because of severe behavior issues and a risk of homicide. He was threatening to kill someone. So when things get to that point, it's mandatory to engage in service. But after that first day, there was no coercion. He was there every single week. And sometimes, you know, we sat down and ate Shirley biscuits. Oh, sorry, I'm thinking about Dante. You're talking about Jason, the father. So the father was not the one that was referred to me. It was the little boy who was referred for an ADHD and behavioral assessment by the pediatrician. And then through sessions with the little boy, he disclosed the abuse. So then at that point, it became imperative that the father engage, but he was receptive from the first session. So he was an incredible dad. I know not every dad is so receptive, but there are some amazing dads out there.
Okay, okay. Thank you so much for that. I'm gonna hand, if there are no more questions coming from the chat right now, I'm gonna hand over to Anderson, who's gonna go to the next section of the program.
Hi, good evening, everyone. Thank you very much, Taitu. I just want to say thank you all for attending. And I have the pleasure of introducing the next speaker to you. The next speaker is Mr. Fabian Sargent. He is a professional social worker who has a bachelor's degree in social work and a master's in public health, both from the University of the West Indies, Cape Town campus. He's currently employed by the Ministry of Culture, Sports and Youth in their youth development program, and he has worked over 12 years in experience in youth work, project management, specialty training in HIV and AIDS education, counseling, phlebotomy, sexual and reproductive health, and parent group facilitation and research. Fabian is currently the president of the Men's Empowerment Network, network support, which has become the premier male empowerment organization in Barbados. He's the chairman of the Special Youth Projects Committee within the Youth Development Program. He's also the vice president of the Barbados Association of Professional Social Workers, and also the founder of his own charity, Supporting Our Society, or better known as SOS. He's held positions as national focal point on Global Youth Coalition on HIV/AIDS. He's been chairman of the National HIV/AIDS Commission Youth Committee, and he's also been a parish ambassador. Fabian also serves as a floor member on the board of the Barbados Fine Planning Association, and always offers a perspective on what positive impact can we further have in our society with what we do. He's passionate about social development of individuals and groups being proactive in addressing social issues. I should also add that the most thing he's most proud of is his 2 sons and his wife and his family. So without any further ado, Mr. Fabian Sargent.
Hi, good evening. Good evening, everyone. I haven't heard some of those things in so long. Whoa, just listening to a bio of yourself, Thank you very much. Coming after Dr. Herbert, I had a real wonderful presentation, and she covered so many areas. Actually, a lot of what I have here that I can just tear up the paper and just approach this from what I should say from an experience standpoint. And when I say experience, I mean experience being someone actually on the ground. And as she was presenting, a number of things were going through my head, which were pretty much part of my presentation in small bits threaded through, but not so direct. So I think that I need to really pull out some stuff. Now, there are tons of studies. Taitu started the presentation by status of statistics across the Caribbean, and clearly we know what the issues are as it relates to boys, as it relates to child sexual abuse and abuse generally across the board. The studies are there. The evidence is clear. We, as I guess most of the persons on this call, are a lot of academics, and it goes to my brain, and I ask myself, how do we translate this level of academia? How do we translate this data into real action? And that is where I get excited. How do we move from speaking about these disheartening statistics and get to a point where we have a national approach, where we have a multi-sectoral approach, where we have all hands on deck, all disciplines within the social sciences on board? Because I feel as if we just get together and talk about these things and then go back to our quarters and nothing happened. Let me share some statistics. Statistics were shared earlier, and I think Taitu mentioned that she didn't have the disaggregated stats, but I have some statistics here from the Child Care Board, and these statistics are from the financial year April 2019 until March 2020. So it gives us a very good idea as to what's happening as of recent as it relates to child abuse in Barbados. So looking at the statistics for physical abuse, actually no, the total number of children reported for that financial year were 611 children reported for child abuse. And 611 is a lot. That number is extremely high, not to cause a problem. I mean, when I say a problem, I mean a problem where professionals get together and say, well, we have an issue that we have to address. Physical abuse were 125 cases. Sexual abuse, 108, and neglect, which took the chunk of the pie at 313 cases. Emotional abuse were 64 cases. And I know emotional abuse is one that is often not really spoken about a lot, because I think that people don't really understand what is emotional abuse. So those are the total statistics for each level of abuse. Now let me break it down a little further by male and female. So for physical abuse, we had 74 males and 51 females. So we had more boys being abused physically than girls. Sexual abuse, we know, based on statistics, history, females were affected more. So we had 95 females versus 13 males sexually abused. These are children. Neglect, we had 173 males. These are 173 boys and 140 females. Emotional abuse were 34 boys, 30 females. And then there was just one for abandonment. And that pretty much is, I want to go any further, but those statistics show us definitely we have a challenge on our hands. Now, it was mentioned before about abusive households. What does that mean in a Barbadian context? What is an abusive household? And I really want to spark your brains. I really would like to get you thinking about the average house. And when I speak of the average house, think about the house that you came from, because oftentimes we try to fix these problems away from us. We look at everything else external, all the things that are happening outside of Barbados, when really and truly many of us come from houses of abuse. Whether it be physical abuse, because we know of our culture, whether it be sexual abuse, something that is extremely taboo, that many of us don't speak about, particularly when you start to elevate yourself. Emotional abuse, a lot of these things lead to depression. There are many individuals who would have suffered in major ways. And what I see coming to me in relation to boys and men, because I've been doing some programs in secondary schools. We started in Dayton Griffith School. And I can tell you from working with boys, even in my own program, over 500 young people that I work with on a daily basis, that many of these boys are hurting. Many of them suffer from what was mentioned earlier of childhood traumas. A lot of unresolved childhood issues that they then take into their adulthood. Now, I asked earlier, what is the national response? Because clearly, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to determine that we need to have a response to child abuse. And the reason why I push for a national response is that children are the future. I mean, we say that sometimes I'm like, whoa, it just sounds so cliche, but children, how we treat to our children will determine the type of society we have later. Many of us were victims of physical abuse because they get lashes, they get beat. And at which point does discipline become abuse? There are many families, many individuals would argue that they do not abuse children, but they beat them because they are products of beating. It worked for me, so it can work for them. And that is the mindset. People do not identify with what is abuse. What is abuse? I mean, Dr. Herbert has some real beautiful slides. And we went through, I mean, I was taken back with that information. But if you go to the average household and tell them, but what you're doing there so is abuse, you will get cursed. How do we get the community practitioners taking these statistics and translate them into community initiatives? Where do we start? I can say that I work in the youth development program for many years. I work with many agencies across Barbados. But generally, I don't see the seriousness generally as it relates to targeted interventions for boys. And recently, I mean, Men Empowerment Network support the group of which I am the president. It was only formed 2 years ago, just over 2 years ago. And one of the things that we try to do is empower men. When I say empower, we try to get men thinking differently. Because when you look at the statistics of abuse, and then you take those statistics and you match, not necessarily match, but watch them grow and look at our prison rate. Look at the men that are admitted to the psychiatric hospital. Look at the violence. When you turn on newspapers and we see who's killing who and who's not killing who, majority of them are males, are men. And if you get a chance to sit and speak to some of these men, the education system would have failed many of them. How are we addressing it in the education system? I am even going to be bold enough and say that some of the challenges even lie in the people that are put there or that initiate these programs, because many of us are products of abuse, if you want to accept it or not. Going to school, teachers, the things that teachers told some of us boys left us like, I can't believe a teacher just said that to me. How do you do training? How do you, at which point do we initiate training, sensitivity training to get teachers? And I speak of teachers one because that's just the education system. But then we can then move to the community and parents. How do you get parents understanding also that what they tell children can be deemed emotional abuse, how they treat them? Many individuals out there do not understand abuse. And we can discuss it as much as possible, but if we do not get these academic definitions to the individuals that really, really need the information, then we will be forever talking. I was on the block recently and I saw a young father with his child in his hand, and he was rolling a joint. This child was no more than a year old. And I told him, X, well, you need to take home the child. What you're doing is not right. you're exposing that child to a drug. And then they were cursing. And there was a lot of violent behavior in the area. And he turned and told me, but then ain't wrong with that. Then ain't wrong with that. She gonna learn this. And there are a lot of fathers out there, and I say fathers because we learn a lot from modeling behaviors. So a lot of the young boys look to their fathers for examples. And a lot of fathers are opposed to any type of training because it is like, how do you want to come and tell me how to be a parent? So we have a lot of work to do at the community level. We have men in relationships. I've known men near the 60s who were still suffering because of things that happened when they were at 9 and 10 years old. And they were still being affected. Where do we start? I know that I've been all over the place, but because it is like a matrix, how do we reach the low-hanging fruit first? I think that we have enough resources within Barbados, both government, private, and within the civil society organizations, that we can come up with a national coordinated strategy to approach this whole issue of child abuse. It must start with education. And when I say education, I don't mean a lot of fancy talk. I'm talking about real grassroots that the average household can understand. Then they also must be involved in that, the whole concept of emotional regulation, managing emotions. So that there needs to be that whole overarching strategy that attacks, and I say attack because that's exactly what we need to do. Because our adulthood is under threat by what has happened in our childhood. And if we don't get together with all the strength that we have, all the human resources, financial resources, the resources are there, but there needs to be a coordinated effort to pull them all together. Or we will just be having this conversation among a select few within the community and the people who really need the information, the ones that definitely you would see at the child guidance clinic, the ones that don't attend PTA meetings, the ones that amount for the parents, the 313 children here who would have reported for neglect to the child care board. Those are the parents we need to get, or guardians. We need a strategy. And that strategy must include parenting. I will pause there for now because there's a lot more that we can discuss, but I try to touch many different areas so that we can spark the conversation as the discussion continues. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Fabian, for that very passionate presentation. Appreciate it. I also appreciate the crucial point you made towards the end about how childhood trauma affects the kind of adults that boys become eventually. And I think that is really one of the key objectives of the forum this evening, is to really pay attention to the cycle and how we can break the cycle of violence. You had also mentioned what can we do at the national level in terms of addressing the gaps in policy and in policy, and particularly in the education system. And you're spot on. And the challenge, the challenge that Barbados has is not unique. It's a serious issue that we have across the entire Caribbean region, where we have an implementation deficit, and it is something that we definitely need to look at. I mean, from where I'm seeing in some of the literature that I've read, there are gaps in legislation, there are gaps in implementation of policies and programs and interventions, and there are gaps in terms of enforcement of laws and procedures that already exist, whether it's in health, whether it's in education, and whether it's in crime prevention. And all of those three things, legislation, education, legislation and education and so on overlap in terms of the kind of interventions that are needed across the board. And the challenge of implementation deficit across the region is something that we have to make an effort to lobby for governments to pay more attention to. You know, tourism can help the economy, but if we don't have healthy adults working in an industry, we don't have healthy adults being entrepreneurs or owning their business, then you know, development will be hampered in a different kind of way, because it affects productivity, it affects our health, and it affects the, you know, the cohesion of families and the harmony in families as well. I want us to just segue to our final featured speaker for the evening, Blacka. I'm going to read your bio, so I'm putting you on standby. And we are about to speak to Owen Blacka Ellis from Jamaica. Owen is a writer, educator, and performing artist. He's a director of communication and PR and research for Ellis International, a Jamaican entertainment production and talent management company that produces a range of theatrical productions, stand-up comedy events, and television projects. Ellis has written scripts for stage, screen, and television. He has also taught English and literature in high schools and has lectured in subjects ranging from writing, voice and speech and arts management to gender and community development. He's more popularly known over the last 3 decades as an actor and comedian, starring in numerous plays and comedy events. He also writes a weekly column for the Jamaica Star, and he is also known as one of the supervising writers for the popular IT and Fancy Cat show. He writes extensively on issues relating to masculinity and gender relations, and has also published 2 books of poetry. Blacka Ellis studied theater arts and drama education at the Edna Manley College of the Visual and Performing Arts and Social Work at University of the West Indies. And he also studied the postgraduate studies in environmental studies from York University in Canada. And he has a very deep interest in the intersection of gender, culture, and the environment. Ellis is currently a senior lecturer in the School of Arts Management and Humanities at the Edna Manley College of Visual and Performing Arts. So without further ado, I'm going to welcome Owen Blacka Ellis to the virtual stage. Blacka, over to you.
Greetings. Light, you can't see my complexion. Greetings all. So I'm very intrigued by what I've been hearing so far. And I'm not going to do a presentation. I want to do really and truly a call for conversation. And I'm doing it from the standpoint of somebody who has experienced verbal and physical abuse as a child. I don't want to frame myself though as a survivor, because survivor to me suggests that we just never did. I want to see myself as an overcomer of child abuse. I was raised by an abusive aunt who physically and verbally massacred me almost daily, but I've overcome it. And I want to make this call for conversation because it's something that we think is worthy of discussion and conversation in this broad Caribbean. And is a topic that we are certainly interested in as Caribbean and as a member of Parenting Partners Caribbean, how our pervasive use of violence as a parenting practice harms our boys and then end up with men who harm in return. But I am seeing myself as an overcomer. So I want to point your attention to a song, lovely little song by an American singer called John Mayer. It's a song that actually won the Grammy for Best Song in 2005. It's a song called Daughters. And in that song, John Mayer encourages parents to be good to their girls. And the chorus says, the fathers, be good to your daughters. Daughters will love like you do. girls become lovers who turn into mothers. So mothers, be good to your daughters too. And this song that seems to encourage parents to be gentle and caring with their children, with their girl children, says in the third verse about boys, he says, boys you can break, you'll know how much they can take. Boys will be strong, and boys soldier on. And though it's an American song, that line, those lines in that song, I think perfectly encapsulates what we in the Caribbean have for years treated with discipline. We have seen discipline as a punitive verb, as opposed to a noun that speaks to a system of principles around self-care and self-protection and personal control. And if we decide that we can break boys, then what happens when those boys become men who are still unmended? If we think we can break boys and boys will be strong, if they really are strong, how is that strength then manifested? How is that strength performed? And if we think that boys soldier on, perhaps the song is right, because it is a way in which boys do soldier on, literally and figuratively, as there seems to be a militarization of maleness in Jamaica. So the question is, how do we as parents in the Caribbean treat with this issue, this problem about how we raise boy children, when physical abuse seems to be a normative approach to teaching boys discipline? That's my question. If we break boys, we're going to end up with the men who need mending. If we don't find ways to teach boys to exemplify heart, H-E-A-R-T, honesty, empathy, accountability, respect, and trust, then we're going to be creating a generation of men who are so hurt, they only know how to hurt. And the cycle will continue and keep going around. So that is my call to conversation. When will we stop breaking boys and end up with men who need mending? When do we stop, when we learn to see that boys can be loved, hugged, kissed, and embraced, and told that it's okay to be a gentleman? So my hope is that we recovering patriarchs can reproduce ourselves, that we may ground green and grow our boys into greatness. Man, call to conversation. Let's talk about how we're gonna make that new man. Yeah, that's it. We're done. Let's talk now.
Thank you very, very much, Blacker. You really made give us some gems there and some serious, very serious food for thought. Before we move into the question and answer section, I wanted to quickly ask you if you could repeat the acronym HEART before, again, for everyone to hear.
Heart. H, honesty. E, A, accountability. R, responsibility. And T, trust. Honesty, empathy, accountability, responsibility, and trust. Can we create boys who can exemplify that?
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. Thank you so much for that. Wow. Wow, wow, wow. Thank you very much. Donna, thank you so much for laying it out for us as well in the chat. I appreciate it. Blacker, you have definitely opened the floor for lots of questions. I'm going to just quickly go through some of the comments and the questions. Some in relation to the earlier presentations, and then quite a few others in relation to the presentation given by Blacker. First, there's a question from Trinidad and Tobago. And the question is, it would be interesting to capture if notions of masculinity, and in the case of male-on-male sexual abuse, how homophobia continues to contribute survivor silence and non-disclosure, as well as family and community silence on non-disclosure. I don't know which panelist wishes to address that, but it came up indirectly, I believe, in Kate's presentation, when she looked at some of the reasons for underreporting of sexual abuse of boys at the Queen Elizabeth Hospital. Kate, is that something you wish to address?
Certainly, and I'd welcome the other presenters to jump in as well, and Dr. Trotman or Ms. Kelman, if you'd like to interject.
Okay.
But that certainly is what we believe to contribute to underreporting of sexual abuse in boys, and for the boys who are brought forward following abuse by a male. There's a lot of shame on the part of the family, and we see higher levels of attrition or dropout. So no shows to appointment, non-continuation with therapy. And again, it appears to be stemming from homophobia and stigma that the boy will be perceived as a victim or as being gay because he's had this type of experience. So it results often in the boy not getting the medical and psychological intervention that he requires.
Okay. There's a question asking about Dante's relationship with his parents, if there was any resentment towards them, and if that was so, was it reconciled?
In that particular case, the relationship with the parents was not able to be repaired, and he actually went to go live with a sibling and kind of launched his adulthood from that home. The degree of the abuse was too severe with both the mother and the father, and it was impossible to reestablish trust in that particular case. The sibling took him in, and he's doing very well.
Okay. There's another one here. Someone is asking for a breakdown of physical abuse, and she uses examples of abuse in Barbados, where they say that we talk of cutas, and that in most cases is not considered abuse. But there's also lashes with a belt, shoes, saucepan. So she's asking for a breakdown of what physical abuse means.
Legally or psychologically, because it's different.
I mean, I could give the legal definition, but I think from your perspective.
Psychologically, it's all abuse.
Yes.
Whether we lash or not, whether it's simple spanking or it's cut ass, it's all abuse. And the fear and the punishment and the condoning of violence, the links to aggression in children, the poor performance at school, the impact on their relationship with peers in the future is the same. I'm not a systemic worker, I'm a clinical worker. I work individually with children and families, and sometimes the path in is to say, okay, I get that this happened to you, this happened to me, this happened in families throughout the Caribbean, but for your child, for your boy child, this isn't working. His behavior is not getting better, it's getting worse, and you need to try something different. So here are some things we can try.
Okay. All right, there's someone that had asked a question. Let me get to it quickly. I'm so sorry, just give me a minute.
Dr. Trotman, who is our child abuse psychologist, is just typing into the chat, any type of physical abuse is harmful to the child.
Okay.
Okay, can I say something?
Yes, please, go ahead. Any of the panelists?
Yeah, you know, I'm speaking from my experience and what I was seeing in my interaction with young boys and men in particular. And I find that whole concept of giving lashes, you know, or what they call discipline, contributes to a lack of skills or a lack of conflict resolution skills, because then, you know, it teaches the child indirectly. As soon as something goes wrong, you raise your hand and you settle it with a lash, whether it be a piece of stick, you know, a belt, your hand, whatever it is. So it indirectly contributes to the lack of the conflict resolution skills and how children really generally interact with each other. That aggression, because it is okay to be angry, but you don't have to be aggressive. You know, and that is where the emotional regulation comes into play. And because a lot of parents and adults generally lack those skills, it is very difficult to say you can't teach what you don't know. And that is the reason why we end up in a situation where our children then, where we're actually, the children are treated the way they are, because the adults lack the skills that are the necessary skills to pass on to them. And that is why I was speaking earlier about parenting programs. And parenting programs is not necessarily telling you how to be a parent or me telling you to parent based on my experiences. What it really does is just giving extra tools to deal with emotional connectivity, extra tools of dealing with anger management or even conflict management. You know, how do you as a parent manage your emotions? How do you manage yourself? Because children are sponges, especially boys who culturally are taught to settle things with their hands, and they're supposed to be rough and tough and emotionally absent and all these things. You know, they absorb, and then they take that type of behavior and matches it to the false sense of masculinity. I mean, it was mentioned, I didn't make mention of masculinity, but then we're taught this false sense of what it is to be a man. And that in itself contributes to a lot of men walking about in what I consider a masquerade party, because then it is more, they're not true to themselves. They really don't know who they are. But I'll pause there for now.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that. Well, there's another question from Jackie Seeley-Burke. Welcome. And one of the questions that Jackie asked is really speaks to the gap in legislation. And she wants us to look at, if I could just find it. She wants us to look at the gap in legislation with regards to how when girls and boys of the same age, under 18, are caught having consensual sex, and yet it is the boy child that is criminalized. And it is something that is actually existing in several of the jurisdictions across the Caribbean. And this is not something that has really been attended to in our legal system. So there's a situation where boys are being criminalized for having consensual sex. So rather than looking at a close in age defense, the boy child is criminalized for having consensual sex. So I don't know if this, any of us here can look at that directly. Because one of the things we have to really look at is the extent to which our legal system is not providing the kind of protective and just framework to handle child abuse and to give the kind of gender-specific attention to child abuse in the legislation. Again, in that same vein, the issue of how sexual abuse is handled within the legislation based on the definition of sexual abuse and the cloud, that gray area around the provisions in the BUGRI provisions, where it is often conflated with consensual sex between men, and then the act of BUGRI, which could be rape of a boy child, and then so it doesn't, the boy child gets lost in the cracks, so to speak. So those are some of the gaps that we have identified in legislation. So I don't know if there's something that any of the panelists wish to address based on their own experience and vantage point and interface with the legal systems.
I would say that the legal system has tremendous challenges across the board. In many areas when it comes to men, you know, we speak about the boys and the sexual activity, but I am no attorney, but from where I sit, it seems as if people those in authority take a hands-off approach, because from the time you start to go down the lines of anything sexual, particularly, it borders on this whole concept of morality, and everybody have their own views, and is about being popular. And I think that there comes a point in time where we need to get past that whole concept of popularity and really look at what is best for the boy or the male or even the female, because it's not only about men, it's about the gaps in the system that create challenges for both genders. Well, for the genders, not both genders, for genders generally, So we really have to take a hand and a real proactive approach. There's this hands-off type of thing, nobody wants to touch it. I mean, it's raised in the media, it is raised by many organizations from many different angles, but yet no one wants to address the issues of the archaic legal system that we have. And if we can't find people who are bold enough to deal with them, we'll be talking about this for another 50 years.
Yeah, I mean, what is really coming out clear to me is that there's an absence of recognition of the humanity of children. And in this case, since we're focusing on boys, the absence of the recognition of the humanity of boys, and I don't know if there's any truth to it, in the sense that it's not something that I have investigated, in terms of making the connections. But one of the things I remember reading from a historian out of Jamaica who focuses on the history of children under slavery was that children were regarded as adults from the age of 12 in terms of the kind of punitive treatment that they received on the plantation. So from the age of 12, they were regarded as adults. So they were beaten in the same way that adult males and adult females were beaten on the plantation, in terms of their number of whips that would be, lashes of the whip that would be meted out. And I think my own thinking has me wondering if that has not had an impact, whether in our DNA or whether passed on from one generation to the next, in terms of not really recognizing the humanity of children, and also in terms of accepting physical violence against children, in this particular case, boys, as something that is acceptable. And then also compound that with this idea that the emotions of boys should be suppressed unless it is something like anger or aggression and so on. I mean, anger and aggression have their place, but certainly not when it ends up in violent circumstances, or when the outcome is violent and causes harm to self and to others around them. So that's just my own thinking. I don't know if, and I would have to do some more research to see if there is a connection, but to my mind, there really has not been a psychic split to say, okay, before independence, under enslavement and colonization, these kinds of behaviors in terms of how, our ancestors were treated on the plantation, including children, is no longer accepted in a post-independence era. That psychic split has not been made. If anything, at a policy level, at the institutional level, when all of the countries in the Caribbean became independent, the assumption was that what we inherited from Britain was good and right and mighty, and that we should follow suit, particularly at the institutional level. So I think there's some dismantling there that needs to be done, and that could be translated into the education system. It is no strange thing to anybody that the education system that we have and the court systems that we have across the Caribbean are based on punitive behavior, are based on condemnation. And those are things that I think are inherited. So I'm going to just end there in terms of, my own comments and taking advantage of the fact that I'm moderating, and then I'm going to then hand over to Anderson if he has anything that he wishes to add or any questions that he wishes to address.
Sure. I wanna address in the same context that you're addressing it. I know we have. My perception is that we've not as you said, on part. I don't know as well, and my perception is that the Black slave, regardless of what age, regardless of what development, was treated like a child. Were disciplined and beaten like a child. I agree with you. I think there's a disconnect between what is childhood and what is adulthood, and how do we develop in that process the thinking of how do we discipline our children in a way that is not linked to the punishment that has been bred into our thinking of what you do. I feel that has manifested, yes, certainly in corporal punishment. I also feel the same thing has manifested in sexual abuse and other abuses as it relates to how we were treated as Black slaves on a plantation. I feel that's permeated all through our culture. And I feel, in fact, I'm not saying I'm feeling, the evidence suggests that this is essentially what has happened, what has transpired. What have we unpacked the psychological impacts? I really wanted to say, at least only in what everybody, what Dr. Herbert said, because if those manifestations occurred during slavery with physical beating, it will certainly continue in terms of negative development in our society in terms of men and women. I think the real key would have been the impact of the gender movement, but it would have seen a market change for women. And therefore, we're seeing that manifestation. When does that begin for men? That's the question. And that really brings to what Black is saying. What are we created for, men? We've decided already what we're created for women. What are we bringing to this new man, this new model to have that impact we want in society? I don't think any of these conversations are in a sphere or in, I think we're saying the same thing from a different angle. I think we've all shown that we're not interconnected, but the question is, as which Fabian and Black are asking, where do we move next? Where do we move to next? Fabian, and in fact, the way that social impact can have. Now we're having all of this, and we just look at legislation. Now, the truth is that I think we need to become the persons who are social intervention specialists, psychologists, need to become the advocates truly for changing legislation. And that is where the next step has to be. But I'm just trying to, really get to that step. What is the intervention that we need to have certainly in the individual context, the familial context, the national context, and how does that permeate through the region? So my question to the panelists, how do we get there?
It sounds very philosophical. So like a conference, actually, Anderson. We have some planning to do.
I really think, though, Anderson, that we have so many resources, and I would continue to say, and I do not think that the resources that we have are utilized in the best possible way.
No, they're not.
We have some excellent, some brilliant people across the landscape of Barbados. But there's something that is just preventing, I do not know what it is, but there's something that is just preventing people who have the capabilities of making the change, or really help denting the change in terms of interacting, in terms of contributing towards policy, in terms of engaging young people and parents and everybody. But for some reason, we have this culture in Barbados where we are hoping somebody else do it for us. And we ain't gonna get far. We ain't gonna get far with our culture. What do you do? I would like everybody to ask, what am I doing in this fight? Where do I sit? How do I create the change in my own little circle? Yeah, Anderson.
Yeah, no. I want to say, because Colleen Wing, she asked that question straight up. Where are the resources? Do we have enough? She asked about what are the other organizations she singled out Paradox.
But Anderson, we got the resources. I was part of that Paradox training, And that I believe they had about 25 parent group facilitators. But then what next? Okay, so we have qualified people out there who are competent in parent group facilitation. What next? Where are they? What do we have after the training? So that's what I'm saying, is that the resource, I believe in my heart, the resources are there now. I don't think we lack resources. We lack coordination and implementation. That is what we lack. We need to get a system where we pull all of these things together. Now I will pause because I see one of my mentors with the hand raised that may be able to, you know, may want to put me in my place.
No, it's okay. I think we have several comments that I think we should repeat.
Yes.
You know, and it's a combination. I think some say, for instance, Dr. Trotman says that there are persons who are interested in child abuse and they're working very hard, but there are not a lot of resources available. But I think we could probably deconstruct what we mean by resources: institutional resources, human resources, financial resources. But there does seem to be a resource issue for sure, and Leanne Worrell also agrees. And to my mind, it's a combination of resources as well as willpower, you know, and the real interest to focus on the matter at hand. And when we think of resources, I think we also have to think about something like corruption. You know, when corruption continues, that's a waste of resources that could be better used to focus on getting the kind of institutional support and the kind of support services that are needed and legislative changes that are needed to address child abuse in a very gender specific way that would address some of the deficits that have been identified this evening that boy children face. Owen Blacker Ellis says that we need to institute healthy rites of passage for boys. Blacker, I'd really love if you have the time, if you could elaborate on that for a minute, even though we are pressed for time and we need to finish. And then Dr. Trotman is also saying that while there are a lot of persons who are willing to help and are working pretty hard, there's a payment issue, you know. Some of the psychologists, the counselors, the social workers, these are professionals and they need to eat. They also have families to feed, you know, so the human resources might be there, but there's a lot more that we need and they also need to be paid. So it's multifaceted. It's a combination of challenges that we have to face. One contributor, Dave, he just said that we need systematic relearning for gender relations in schools. Absolutely, absolutely. You know, and another one that I believe is also quite gendered, another contribution, says that the caring professions are systematically devalued, you know. So what we're seeing really and truly is that very thing that we need to be focusing on. There are lots of complex issues that are affecting the way we
You can't talk longer. Can't get till 8. You can't get till 8.
So I'm gonna end there. Blacker, is that you? Turn off the microphone.
Thank you, gentlemen, Mr. Clayton Springer.
Who is that? Who has the microphone on going on like that?
Yeah, look.
Yeah.
Blacker needs to mute his mic.
Blacker needs to mute his mic.
The host can mute him.
Huh?
The host can mute him
Host can
as
mute
well.
him.
Right? All right, so no one will interfere. Just want to wish you all the best. God's blessings.
Can you host move everybody?
I know your family is very supportive of that kind of support, and whatever you wish will be there for you. So everyone raise their glasses, we're gonna toast the bride and the groom.
Session. You hear it?
Hooray.
Hooray. Hooray.
I completely concur. There will be conflict. I think the people don't must leave.
But if you have to war, Obel, make war indeed. You can get peace at night.
Somebody needs to mute Blacker.
I'm trying.
Okay, I just sent him a WhatsApp as well, but he's speaking and not hearing.
Mhm.
He's muted now.
Yeah,
Okay.
thanks.
Thank you very much.
Okay. All right. Well, at least I know the wedding went really well.
Hello,
Yes.
good evening.